Sarah Martinez had always been the reliable one. At 32, she worked as a park ranger in the remote wilderness of Montana's Glacier National Park. Her job was simple most days: guide tourists, maintain trails, and keep everyone safe. She never imagined that one stormy October evening would test every skill she had learned in her 8 years of service. The weather report that morning had been wrong. Dead wrong. What started as a light drizzle quickly turned into a violent thunderstorm that caught everyone off guard. Sarah was leading a group of 12 hikers back to the main lodge when the first lightning strike hit a tree just 50 yards away. The crack was so loud that several people screamed and dropped to the ground. "Everyone stay calm," Sarah shouted over the growing wind. "We need to get to the emergency shelter. It's about 2 miles from here." The group consisted mostly of city folks who had come to Montana for a peaceful hiking vacation. There was Jim, a lawyer from Chicago with his teenage son Marcus. Lisa and Tom were newlyweds from California who had never been in a real storm before. The elderly couple, Frank and Betty, were in their 70s and already struggling with the rough terrain. Maria, a single mother, was there with her 8-year-old daughter Emma. 3 college friends, Jake, Kevin, and Alex, had been joking around all day but now looked genuinely scared. As they started moving toward the shelter, the rain began falling harder. Within minutes it became a downpour that soaked through their jackets and made the trail slippery and dangerous. Sarah led the way with her flashlight, constantly checking behind her to make sure everyone was keeping up. "Stay together," she called back. "Hold on to each other if you need to." The trail gets rocky up ahead. The wind was getting stronger by the minute. Trees swayed violently overhead, and Sarah could hear branches cracking and falling in the distance. She had been through storms before, but this one felt different, more dangerous, more unpredictable. About halfway to the shelter, Frank stumbled and fell hard on his knee. Betty cried out as she tried to help him up. Sarah rushed back to them, her heart pounding. Frank's face was pale with pain, and when he tried to stand, he couldn't put weight on his left leg. "I think it's broken," Frank said through gritted teeth. "You all go ahead. Don't worry about us." "We're not leaving anyone behind," Sarah said firmly. She looked around at the group. Everyone was cold, wet, and scared. The storm was getting worse, and they still had over a mile to go. That's when they heard it. A low rumbling sound that wasn't thunder. Sarah's blood went cold as she recognized what it was. In the distance, through the rain and darkness, she could see shapes moving between the trees. Bears. A mother bear with 2 cubs, probably looking for shelter from the storm just like they were. "Nobody move," Sarah whispered urgently. She slowly reached for the bear spray on her belt, but her heart sank as she felt the empty holster. She had used the last of her spray earlier that week on a different hike and hadn't had time to replace it yet. The bears were about 100 yards away, but they had definitely noticed the group. The mother bear stood up on her hind legs, sniffing the air. Sarah knew that bears could smell people from miles away, and with the wind swirling in all directions, their scent was probably everywhere. "What do we do?" Lisa whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Sarah's mind raced. She had her emergency flare gun, but it only had 6 shots. 6 shots for a mother bear protecting her cubs in a storm. She had been trained to use it only as a last resort, and only if she was absolutely sure she could scare the bears away without making them more aggressive. The mother bear dropped back down to all 4s and started moving toward them slowly. Her cubs followed behind her, staying close to their mother's side. Sarah could see that the bears were just as scared and confused as the humans were. The storm had probably driven them from their usual shelter, and they were looking for a safe place to wait it out. "Everyone, very slowly start backing toward that big rock behind us," Sarah said quietly. "Don't make eye contact with the bears. Move like you're in slow motion." The group began to move, but Frank couldn't put weight on his injured leg. Jim and Marcus each took one of his arms and helped him along. Emma, the 8-year-old, was crying quietly, and her mother Maria was trying to comfort her while also watching the bears with terror in her eyes. The mother bear was now about 50 yards away. She made a huffing sound that Sarah recognized as a warning. The bear was telling them to stay away from her cubs. But in the storm and darkness, with limited visibility, the situation was becoming more dangerous by the second. Sarah pulled out her flare gun and checked it. 6 bright red emergency flares. Each one could create a loud noise and bright flash that might scare the bears away. But if it didn't work, if the bears charged instead of running, those 6 shots would be all they had between life and death. The wind howled louder, and another lightning strike illuminated the entire area for a brief moment. In that flash of light, Sarah could see that there weren't just 3 bears. There were 5. Another adult bear and an older cub had appeared from a different direction. The group was now surrounded, Sarah, Jim whispered urgently. What's the plan? Sarah looked at the flare gun in her hands, then at the terrified faces of the people depending on her to keep them safe. The storm was getting worse. Frank couldn't walk, and they were trapped between multiple bears in the middle of nowhere. Her radio had been damaged by the rain and wasn't working. No one knew exactly where they were or that they needed help. She took a deep breath and made a decision. They would try to make it to a cluster of large rocks about 30 yards away. The rocks would give them some protection and a better defensive position. If the bears followed them, she would use the flare gun to try to scare them away. When I count to 3, we're going to move quickly but calmly toward those rocks, Sarah told the group. Stay together. Don't run unless I tell you to run. And whatever happens, trust me. As thunder crashed overhead and the rain poured down even harder, Sarah raised the flare gun and prepared to lead the group through the most dangerous situation of her life. 1, 2, 3, Sarah whispered, and the group began moving toward the rocks as quietly as they could manage in the storm. The first 20 yards went smoothly. The bears seemed more interested in finding their own shelter than bothering with the humans. But just as Sarah started to think they might make it safely, Emma tripped over a fallen branch and cried out in pain and fear. The sound cut through the storm like a knife. All 5 bears immediately turned their attention to the group. The mother bear with cubs let out a loud grunt and started moving faster in their direction. The other adult bear, a massive male, rose up on his hind legs again and made a threatening woofing sound. Keep moving, Sarah said firmly, though her heart was racing. Almost there. They reached the cluster of rocks just as the first bear got close enough that Sarah could see her clearly in the flashlight beam. The mother bear was huge, probably weighing over 300 pounds, and her protective instincts were clearly in full gear. She stopped about 20 feet away and made another huffing sound, swaying her head back and forth. Sarah positioned herself between the bears and the group. Jim and Marcus had gotten Frank behind the largest rock, and Maria was holding Emma close while the others huddled together. Everyone was soaking wet and shivering, but they were alive and temporarily protected. Is she going to attack? Kevin asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Not if I can help it, Sarah replied, keeping her eyes on the bears while she spoke. The mother bear was clearly agitated, but she wasn't charging yet. She was testing them, trying to figure out if they were a threat to her cubs. Sarah knew that bears usually only attacked humans when they felt cornered or when their cubs were in danger. The key was to show the bears that the humans weren't a threat, while also demonstrating that they wouldn't be easy prey. She raised the flare gun and fired the first shot into the air, away from the bears but close enough to get their attention. The bright red flare exploded in the stormy sky with a loud pop that echoed off the surrounding mountains. The effect was immediate. All 5 bears jumped and looked up at the bright light. The cubs moved closer to their mother, and the large male bear dropped back down to all 4s and took several steps backward. But they didn't run away. Instead, they seemed even more alert and focused on the group. 1 down, 5 to go, Sarah muttered to herself, checking the flare gun. She'd been hoping the first shot would be enough to scare all the bears away, but these animals were either too hungry, too confused by the storm, or too protective of their territory to give up easily. The rain was coming down so hard now that it was difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. Lightning continued to flash across the sky every few seconds, followed by booming thunder that made everyone jump. The temperature was dropping fast, and Sarah could see that several people in the group were starting to show signs of hypothermia. We can't stay here much longer, she realized. The emergency shelter was still over half a mile away, and Frank couldn't walk on his injured leg. Even if they scared off the bears, they would need to find another solution quickly. That's when the large male bear started moving toward them again. Unlike the mother bear, who was being cautious and protective, this bear seemed more aggressive and determined. He approached with his head lowered and his ears back, classic signs that he was considering an attack. Sarah aimed the flare gun directly at the ground in front of the approaching bear and fired the second shot. The flare hit the wet earth with a bright flash and a loud hissing sound as it burned in the rain. The bear stopped and backed up a few steps, but he didn't retreat. 4 shots left, Sarah said under her breath. She was starting to worry that the flare gun wouldn't be enough. These bears were either very brave or very desperate. and the storm was making everything more chaotic and unpredictable. "Sarah, look," Marcus whispered urgently, pointing to their left. Through the rain and darkness, they could see lights in the distance. Flashlight beams moving through the trees heading in their direction. It was a search and rescue team, probably sent out when the group didn't return to the lodge as scheduled. Hope flooded through Sarah's chest, but she knew the rescue team was still several minutes away. Too far to help if the bears decided to attack right now. She needed to keep everyone safe until help arrived. The mother bear with cubs had moved closer while Sarah was distracted by the approaching lights. Now all 5 bears were within 30 feet of the group, forming a loose semicircle around the rocks. The humans were trapped with nowhere to go. "Everyone stay perfectly still," Sarah instructed the group. "Help is coming, but we need to hold our position for a few more minutes." The largest bear, the aggressive male, took another step forward. His massive paws made squishing sounds in the muddy ground, and Sarah could see his teeth gleaming in her flashlight beam. This bear was definitely considering an attack. She raised the flare gun and aimed it directly at the bear's face, hoping she wouldn't have to actually shoot him. Bears were protected animals in the national park, and she didn't want to hurt one unless there was absolutely no other choice. "Back off," she said loudly, trying to make her voice sound confident and authoritative. "We don't want any trouble." The bear stopped but didn't retreat. He was so close now that Sarah could hear his heavy breathing over the sound of the storm. His small dark eyes were fixed on her, and she could sense that he was making a decision about whether to charge or not. Behind her, she could hear Emma crying and Frank groaning in pain from his injured leg. The rescue lights were getting closer, but they were still too far away. Sarah realized that she might have to use another flare shot, leaving her with only 3 remaining. Just then, a huge crack of thunder shook the entire mountainside, followed immediately by a lightning strike that hit a tree less than 50 yards away. The tree exploded in a shower of sparks and flaming branches, lighting up the area like daylight for several seconds. The sudden explosion of light and sound sent all the bears running in different directions. The mother bear grabbed her cubs and disappeared into the trees. The large male bear turned and ran the opposite way, crashing through the underbrush as fast as his massive body could carry him. Within seconds, all 5 bears were gone, leaving the group alone among the rocks with nothing but the storm and their own relief. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah called out, quickly checking on each person in the group. Everyone was cold, wet, and scared, but unharmed except for Frank's injured leg. The rescue lights were now close enough that Sarah could see the shapes of people moving toward them through the trees. "Here," she shouted, firing another flare into the air to signal their location. "We're over here." 3 rescue workers appeared out of the storm, wearing bright yellow rain gear and carrying powerful flashlights. Sarah had never been so happy to see anyone in her entire life. "Thank God you found us," Sarah called out as the rescue team reached their position among the rocks. The lead rescue worker was a woman about Sarah's age named Captain Rodriguez. She quickly assessed the situation and began organizing the evacuation. "We've got a medical emergency and severe weather conditions," she radioed back to base. "Need immediate helicopter evacuation for injured hiker and ground transport for the rest of the group." But as soon as she said it, another massive lightning strike hit nearby, and the radio crackled with static. "Helicopters grounded," came the response. "Storm's too dangerous for air rescue. You'll have to bring everyone out on foot." Frank was in serious pain and couldn't put any weight on his injured leg. The rescue team had brought a portable stretcher, but carrying him over a mile of rough, muddy terrain in the storm would be extremely difficult and dangerous. "How long until the weather clears?" Sarah asked. Captain Rodriguez checked her weather radio and shook her head grimly. "This storm system is bigger than anyone predicted. We're looking at least 3 more hours of heavy rain, lightning, and high winds. Possibly longer." Sarah looked around at the group. Everyone was shivering violently from the cold and wet conditions. Emma, the 8-year-old, was showing early signs of hypothermia. Her lips were turning blue and she was having trouble speaking clearly. Betty, the elderly woman, was also struggling with the cold and looked exhausted. "We need to get everyone warm and dry, fast," Sarah said. "Is there anywhere closer than the main shelter?" One of the other rescue workers, a young man named Torres, spoke up. "There's an old ranger cabin about half a mile north of here. It's been abandoned for years, but the roof should still be solid. We could hole up there until the storm passes. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than trying to march everyone through the storm for another hour or more. Captain Rodriguez made the decision. Torres, you and Miller take point. Sarah, you stay with the injured hiker. I'll bring up the rear with the rest of the group. They began moving through the forest toward the abandoned cabin. The rescue team had brought better flashlights and emergency supplies, which made the journey somewhat easier. But the storm was still raging with full force. Lightning continued to flash across the sky every few seconds, and the wind was so strong that it knocked people off balance. Emma was getting weaker by the minute. Her mother Maria was practically carrying her, but Maria was also struggling with the cold and exhaustion. About halfway to the cabin, Emma collapsed completely. She's going into hypothermia, Captain Rodriguez said after checking the little girl's condition. We need to get her warm immediately. Sarah made a quick decision. Torres, you and I will carry her. Rodriguez, you take over with Frank. We need to move faster. Torres nodded, and they fashioned a makeshift carrier using their rain jackets. Emma was barely conscious as they lifted her and started moving through the trees as quickly as they could manage on the slippery, uneven ground. The old ranger cabin appeared through the rain and darkness like a miracle. It was a small one-room building made of logs and stone, probably built 50 years earlier. The windows were boarded up and the door was locked, but Torres kicked it open without hesitation. Inside, the cabin was dry and relatively warm. There was an old wood-burning stove in the corner and a stack of firewood that had been left behind years ago. More importantly, there were some old blankets and basic emergency supplies stored in a chest. Get Emma wrapped up in these blankets immediately, Captain Rodriguez ordered as they carried the unconscious girl inside. Sarah, can you get that stove lit? Sarah quickly examined the old stove. It was rusty and hadn't been used in years, but it looked functional. She found some old newspaper and kindling, and within minutes she had a small fire burning. The warmth began to fill the cabin almost immediately. Everyone crowded around the stove, stripping off their wet outer clothes and wrapping themselves in the old blankets they had found. Emma began to show signs of improvement as her body temperature slowly started to rise. Frank was also in better condition now that he was out of the rain and wind. Captain Rodriguez examined his injured leg more thoroughly and determined that it was probably a severe sprain rather than a break, which was good news. We should be able to wait out the storm here, she said. This cabin is solid and we've got heat and shelter. As soon as the weather clears, we can call for helicopter evacuation. But just as she said it, they heard a sound that made everyone freeze, a low rumbling growl coming from outside the cabin. Then another one from a different direction. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what was happening. The bears they had encountered earlier hadn't gone far. They had probably been following the scent trail left by the humans, and now they had tracked the group to the cabin. How many entrances does this cabin have? Captain Rodriguez asked quietly. Torres checked quickly. Just the front door and one window on the back wall that's not boarded up. The growling sounds were getting closer. Through gaps in the boarded-up windows, they could see dark shapes moving around the cabin. The bears had found them and were investigating their new shelter. The fire, Sarah realized with horror. The smoke from the chimney and the smell of wood burning. It probably attracted them. Captain Rodriguez was already checking her equipment. She had bear spray and a tranquilizer gun, both of which were much better options than Sarah's flare gun, but she also looked concerned. In normal conditions, I'd try to scare them off with noise and the tranq gun, she said. But in this storm with multiple bears and injured people who can't move quickly, it's too risky. A loud thump against the cabin wall made everyone jump. One of the bears was testing the structure, probably trying to figure out how to get inside. The cabin was old but solid, built to withstand harsh mountain weather. However, it hadn't been designed to keep out determined bears. Another thump, this time against the front door. The old wood creaked ominously but held. Emma, who had been unconscious just minutes earlier, was now awake and terrified. She clung to her mother and whispered, "Are the bears going to eat us?" "No, sweetheart," Maria said, trying to keep her voice calm. "The nice people are going to keep us safe." Sarah looked around the cabin, counting the people and assessing their situation. 12 civilians plus 3 rescue workers, 1 injured man who couldn't walk, 1 little girl recovering from hypothermia, 1 elderly couple who were exhausted and scared, and an unknown number of bears outside who seemed very interested in getting inside. Captain Rodriguez was trying to radio for additional help, but the storm was still interfering with communications. She could get through occasionally, but the signal kept cutting out. Base camp, this is Rodriguez. She spoke into the radio during a brief, clear moment. We're holed up in the Old North cabin with civilians. Multiple bears outside. Need immediate assistance when weather permits. The response was mostly static, but they could make out a few words. Copy. Storm. Hours. Hang tight. Another loud thump against the cabin, this time accompanied by a scratching sound. One of the bears was trying to claw its way through the wooden door. The scratching continued for several minutes, then stopped. Everyone held their breath, listening. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain on the roof and wind in the trees. Then they heard something that made their blood run cold. The sound of claws on the roof. One of the bears had climbed up and was walking around on top of the cabin, probably looking for another way inside. The old wooden roof creaked and groaned under the animal's weight. Sarah looked at Captain Rodriguez, who was checking her tranquilizer gun with a grim expression. They both knew that if the bears found a way inside, the situation would become deadly very quickly. The scratching and clawing sounds continued on the roof above them. Everyone in the cabin looked up nervously as dust and small pieces of wood began falling from the ceiling beams. The bear was definitely trying to find a weak spot in the roof structure. That roof is 50 years old, Torres whispered to Captain Rodriguez. I don't know how much weight it can handle. Sarah was doing quick mental calculations. A large adult bear could weigh anywhere from 300 to 600 pounds. The old cabin roof had probably been built strong enough to handle heavy snow loads, but it had been weathered by decades of harsh mountain conditions. If the bear found a weak spot or damaged area, it might be able to break through. Captain Rodriguez made a difficult decision. We need to make some noise and try to scare it off the roof before it finds a way in. She motioned for everyone to gather around the wood stove, as far from the roof opening as possible. Then she positioned herself near the front door with her tranquilizer gun ready. On my count, everyone yell as loud as you can, she instructed. Bang on pots, stamp your feet, make as much noise as possible. We want to convince that bear that there are too many humans in here to mess with. 1, 2, 3. The cabin exploded with sound as 15 people yelled, shouted, and banged on everything they could find. Jim and Marcus drummed on the metal sides of the wood stove. Lisa and Tom clapped their hands and stomped their feet. Even little Emma, still wrapped in blankets, managed to contribute a high-pitched scream. The noise worked. The scratching sounds on the roof stopped immediately, followed by heavy footsteps as the bear moved across the roof and climbed back down. Through the gaps in the boarded windows, they could see the dark shape moving away from the cabin. But their relief was short-lived. Within minutes, they heard growling and snuffling sounds coming from multiple directions around the cabin. The loud noise had scared away one bear, but it had also attracted the attention of others. Now it sounded like there were even more bears outside than before. How many are out there? Jake asked nervously. Torres peered through a small gap in one of the boarded windows. I can see at least 4, maybe 5. They're circling the cabin. Sarah felt her heart sink. The situation was getting worse instead of better. More bears meant more danger, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. They could be trapped in the cabin for hours with hungry, aggressive animals just outside. Captain Rodriguez checked her tranquilizer gun again. She had 6 tranquilizer darts, which might be enough to deal with the bears if she could get clear shots at them. But tranquilizer darts took several minutes to take effect, and an angry bear could do a lot of damage in those few minutes. What if we just wait them out? Maria suggested. Maybe they'll get bored and leave. Bears don't get bored, Sarah replied. Especially not when they can smell food and people. And these bears are probably hungry and looking for shelter from the storm just like we were. A loud bang against the back wall made everyone jump. One of the bears was testing the unboarded window, trying to see if it could break through the glass and wooden frame. The window held, but they could hear the bear pushing against it with significant force. That window won't last long if it keeps pushing, Torres observed. Captain Rodriguez positioned herself where she could see the back window while still keeping an eye on the front door. If any bear gets inside, everyone move to the opposite corner immediately. Don't try to fight it. Don't try to run past it. Just get as far away as possible and let me handle it. The banging on the back window continued for several more minutes, then stopped. For a moment, Sarah hoped the bear had given up. But then she heard a new sound that made her stomach drop. Scratching and scraping sounds were coming from the stone foundation of the cabin. One of the bears had apparently found a small gap or opening between the foundation stones and was trying to dig its way underneath the cabin floor. "This is bad," Torres said quietly. "If it gets under the floor, it might be able to come up through a loose floorboard." Everyone looked down at the old wooden floor beneath their feet. The boards were solid, but some of them showed gaps in wear from decades of use. If a determined bear could get underneath and push up from below, it might find a weak spot. Sarah moved to the center of the cabin and began testing the floorboards with her foot, looking for any that felt loose or unstable. She found 3 boards near the back corner that had some give to them when she pressed down. "Everyone stay away from this corner," she warned the group. "These boards might not hold if something pushes up from underneath." The digging and scratching sounds continued from below. Whatever bear was down there was working systematically, probably following the foundation wall looking for the best place to break through. Captain Rodriguez tried the radio again, hoping for a clear signal. This time she managed to get through to base camp with a relatively clear transmission. "Base, this is Rodriguez. Emergency situation at North Cabin. Multiple bears attempting to breach structure. Civilian group including injured and hypothermic individuals. Need immediate helicopter support as soon as weather permits." The response crackled through with static but was mostly understandable. "Copy, Rodriguez. Helicopter on standby. But pilot says minimum 2 hours before conditions safe for flight. Weather service shows storm intensifying before it clears. Can you hold position?" Affirmative, but barely. Bears are actively trying to get inside. May need to abandon structure if they breach. Copy. Ground team with additional equipment mobilizing, but estimate 90 minutes to your position in current conditions. Hold tight. Captain Rodriguez put down the radio and looked at the group with a serious expression. "Help is coming, but we need to keep these bears out for at least 2 hours. Possibly longer." As if the bears had heard the radio conversation, the scratching from underneath the floor became more intense and urgent. Then they heard a new sound, splintering wood. "It's breaking through," Sarah said grimly. One of the loose floorboards in the back corner began to lift slightly, pushed up from below by something strong and determined. Dust and debris fell through the gap as the board moved. Captain Rodriguez raised her tranquilizer gun and aimed it at the lifting floorboard. "Everyone get behind me as far back as possible." The floorboard lifted higher, and they could see dark fur and the tip of a massive paw pushing up through the gap. The bear had found a way in. "Here we go," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, her finger on the trigger. The floorboard suddenly snapped in half with a loud crack, and a huge brown paw pushed up through the opening. Then a massive head appeared, followed by powerful shoulders as the bear began squeezing its way up through the floor. Captain Rodriguez fired the first tranquilizer dart, hitting the bear directly in the shoulder. The animal roared in pain and anger but kept pushing its way up through the broken floorboard. Tranquilizer darts took several minutes to work, and this bear was very much awake and very angry. Sarah raised her flare gun, realizing she might need to use her remaining shots to help drive off the bear. But with people crowded behind her and limited space in the cabin, she would have to be very careful about where she aimed. The bear was now halfway through the floor, roaring and thrashing as it tried to pull the rest of its massive body up into the cabin. Everyone pressed against the far wall as far from the angry animal as they could get. 2 more darts, Captain Rodriguez said, firing her second shot into the bear's chest. But now they could hear more scratching and digging sounds from other parts of the foundation. The other bears had seen their companion finding success and were copying the technique. Within minutes, they might have multiple bears breaking through the floor, simultaneously. Sarah looked at the flare gun in her hands and realized that 3 remaining flares might not be enough to save 15 people from a coordinated bear attack inside a confined space. The bear that had broken through the floor was now 3/4 of the way into the cabin, roaring and swiping at the air with massive claws. Captain Rodriguez's 2 tranquilizer darts were starting to slow it down, but the animal was still very much a threat. Worse, they could hear at least 2 more bears digging at other spots under the foundation. "We need to get out of here," Torres said urgently. "If multiple bears get inside at once, we won't be able to control the situation." Captain Rodriguez fired her 3rd tranquilizer dart into the bear's neck, finally causing the animal to slow down significantly. But even as it became sluggish from the drugs, its massive body was blocking the hole in the floor, preventing them from using that exit route. "Front door," Captain Rodriguez ordered. "Everyone out, single file, stay together." But as Torres reached for the door handle, they heard heavy breathing and snuffling sounds right outside. At least one bear was positioned directly in front of the door, waiting for them to emerge. They were trapped. Bears were breaking in through the floor. Bears were waiting outside the door, and bears were digging under other parts of the cabin. Sarah realized they had only minutes before the situation became completely hopeless. That's when she remembered something from her ranger training. Bears hated fire more than almost anything else. They were instinctively afraid of flames and smoke, probably from thousands of years of evolutionary experience with forest fires. "The wood stove," she said suddenly. "Help me move it." "What are you doing?" Captain Rodriguez asked while keeping her gun trained on the drugged bear in the floor. "Creating a distraction," Sarah replied, already pulling burning logs out of the stove with a pair of metal tongs. "Bears are terrified of fire. If we can create enough smoke and flames, they might back off long enough for us to get everyone out." She began placing the burning logs near the front door and the broken floorboard where the bear was stuck. The dry wood caught fire quickly, creating bright flames and thick smoke that began filling the cabin. The effect on the bear was immediate. Even in its drugged state, the animal's instinctive fear of fire kicked in. It began struggling to back out through the hole in the floor, desperate to get away from the flames. Outside, they could hear the other bears making nervous whimpering sounds as smoke began pouring out through gaps in the cabin walls and roof. The scratching and digging sounds stopped as the animals moved away from the smoke. "It's working," Torres said with amazement. "They're backing off." Sarah continued feeding the fire with furniture and anything else that would burn. The cabin was filling with smoke, making it hard to breathe. But the psychological effect on the bears was exactly what she had hoped for. "Everyone cover your mouths and noses," Captain Rodriguez instructed, pulling out bandanas and cloth to help filter the smoke. "We're going to make a run for it." The bear that had been stuck in the floor finally managed to pull itself back down through the hole and disappear. Sarah could hear it crashing through the underbrush as it ran away from the burning cabin. "Now!" Captain Rodriguez shouted, throwing open the front door. They rushed outside into the storm, coughing and gasping from the smoke, but grateful to be breathing fresh air again. The bears were nowhere to be seen, driven away by their instinctive fear of the fire. But now they faced a new problem. The cabin behind them was burning, and they were back outside in the middle of a dangerous storm with nowhere to go. Frank still couldn't walk on his injured leg. Emma was still weak from hypothermia, and everyone was exhausted. "The emergency shelter," Sarah said, pointing through the rain toward a distant ridge. "It's about 1.5 miles from here. We can make it if we move fast." Captain Rodriguez nodded grimly. They fashioned a stretcher for Frank using poles and jackets, and Torres and Miller took the front and back positions to carry him. Sarah took point with her remaining flare gun, while Captain Rodriguez brought up the rear with her tranquilizer gun. The journey through the storm was brutal. The wind was stronger than ever, and the rain was coming down in sheets so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Lightning continued to flash across the sky, and thunder crashed around them constantly. Emma was struggling again, her small body unable to generate enough heat to fight off the cold and wet conditions. Maria was carrying her daughter, but Maria herself was stumbling with exhaustion. About halfway to the emergency shelter, both mother and daughter collapsed in the mud. "We can't keep going like this," Jim said, breathing heavily as he helped his son Marcus stay upright against the wind. "Some of us aren't going to make it." Sarah looked around at the group. Everyone was at their physical and mental limits. Betty and Frank were both showing signs of serious hypothermia, despite the blankets they had wrapped around them. The 3 college friends were young and strong, but even they were struggling against the brutal conditions. That's when she heard it. A sound that cut through the storm like a beacon of hope. The distant thrum of helicopter rotors. "They're coming," she shouted over the wind. "The rescue helicopter." Everyone looked up, trying to spot the aircraft through the rain and darkness. The sound was definitely getting closer, but they couldn't see any lights yet. Captain Rodriguez tried her radio again. "This is Rodriguez to rescue helicopter. We're about 1/2 mile south of the burning cabin, moving toward emergency shelter. Multiple civilians in critical condition." The response came through clearly for the first time all night. "Copy, Rodriguez. We have visual on the cabin fire, using that as reference point to locate your group." "Pop a flare for visual confirmation." Sarah raised her flare gun without hesitation and fired one of her remaining 2 shots high into the stormy sky. The bright red flare cut through the rain and darkness like a star, clearly visible from miles away. "Visual confirmed." came the helicopter pilot's voice. "We see your flare. Moving to intercept. Be advised, landing conditions are extremely hazardous. We'll have to do this fast." Within minutes, they could see the powerful searchlight of the rescue helicopter cutting through the storm. The aircraft appeared through the rain like something from a dream, its rotors beating against the wind as the pilot fought to maintain control in the dangerous conditions. The helicopter couldn't land in the rough, muddy terrain where they were standing. Instead, it hovered about 20 feet above them while rescue workers rappelled down on ropes. The downwash from the rotors created a hurricane of wind and rain that knocked several people to their knees. "Critical patients first," the lead rescue worker shouted as he touched down. Emma and Frank were loaded into rescue baskets and hoisted up to the helicopter. Betty was next, followed by Maria, but as they were loading the fifth person, disaster struck. A powerful gust of wind caught the helicopter and pushed it sideways. The pilot fought to regain control, but another wind shear sent the aircraft into a dangerous spin. "We're losing control," came the pilot's voice over the radio. "Have to pull back. Cannot maintain hover in these conditions." The helicopter lurched away from the group, disappearing back into the storm with 5 of the civilians safely aboard, but leaving 10 people still stranded on the mountainside. Sarah watched the helicopter lights fade into the darkness and felt her heart sink. They had been so close to rescue, and now they were back to fighting for survival in the storm with no shelter and nowhere to go. "The emergency shelter is still our best option," Captain Rodriguez said grimly. "We keep moving." But as they started walking again, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood freeze. The low, rumbling growl of a bear much closer than before. Then another growl from a different direction. The bears had followed their scent trail and found them again. And this time there was no cabin to hide in and no fire to scare them away. Sarah looked at the flare gun in her hands and realized she had only 1 shot left. 1 shot to protect 10 exhausted, hypothermic people from multiple bears in the middle of a raging storm. "We're out of bullets," she heard Captain Rodriguez shout as she checked her tranquilizer gun and found it empty. Panic hit the group like a physical blow. Without weapons, without shelter, and without hope of immediate rescue, they were completely defenseless against the bears that were now circling them in the darkness. Sarah raised the flare gun with trembling hands, knowing that her 1 remaining shot might be the only thing standing between her friends and a horrible death. The storm roared around them. Lightning split the sky, and somewhere in the darkness, hungry bears were moving closer with every passing second. Sarah's hands were shaking as she held the flare gun, but not from the cold. The weight of 10 lives rested on her 1 remaining shot. In the darkness around them, she could hear at least 3 bears moving through the underbrush, their heavy paws squelching in the mud as they closed in. "Everyone get behind me," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Form a tight group and don't make any sudden movements." Captain Rodriguez was checking her equipment desperately, hoping to find something they could use as a weapon. Torres and Miller positioned themselves on either side of the group with their flashlights, trying to keep track of the bears' positions. "There," Miller whispered, pointing to their left. "About 30 feet. Big one." Sarah turned her flashlight in that direction and saw the massive silhouette of a bear moving between the trees. Its eyes reflected the light like 2 glowing coals. This was the same aggressive male they had encountered earlier, and he looked even more determined now. "Another one on the right," Torres said urgently. A second bear emerged from the darkness. This one smaller but moving with the quick, nervous energy of a hungry animal. Behind it, Sarah could see the shadowy forms of what looked like 2 cubs. It's the mother with cubs, Sarah realized. She's desperate to protect them, and she probably sees us as a threat. The situation was getting worse by the second. 2 adult bears, both with different motivations for being aggressive, plus cubs that would make the mother bear extremely dangerous to approach. The large male bear took another step toward the group. He was close enough now that Sarah could see his massive claws and the steam rising from his breath in the cold air. She raised the flare gun and aimed it directly at him. "I don't want to hurt you," she said to the bear, knowing it couldn't understand her words but hoping her tone might convey that she wasn't looking for a fight. "We just want to get home safely." The bear stopped and tilted its head as if it was actually listening to her voice. For a moment, Sarah thought it might work. Maybe the bear would decide they weren't worth the trouble and move on. But then lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the entire scene in stark detail. The sudden bright light spooked both bears simultaneously. The male bear reared up on his hind legs and let out a deafening roar. The mother bear moved quickly to put herself between the humans and her cubs, also rising up and displaying her full, intimidating height. "They're going to charge," Captain Rodriguez said grimly. "Everyone get ready to run." "We can't run," Sarah replied. "Frank can't move fast enough, and running will just trigger their chase instinct." She was right. Bears could run up to 35 miles per hour, much faster than any human, especially humans who were exhausted and struggling through muddy terrain in a storm. Running would just delay the inevitable and probably make the bears more aggressive. The male bear dropped back to all fours and started moving toward them with purpose. This was it. Sarah aimed the flare gun directly at the ground in front of the approaching bear, hoping the bright flash and loud noise would be enough to scare both animals away. Just as she was about to pull the trigger, a new sound cut through the storm. The deep, powerful roar of helicopter rotors, much closer than before. The rescue helicopter had returned, but this time, instead of trying to hover and lower rescue workers, the pilot took a different approach. The helicopter swooped low over the group, its powerful searchlight blazing like a miniature sun. The aircraft passed directly over the bears at an altitude of less than 50 feet, the roar of its engines drowning out even the thunder. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both bears, already nervous from the storm and the lightning, were completely overwhelmed by the massive, loud, brightly lit machine passing overhead. The male bear turned and ran into the trees as fast as his legs could carry him. The mother bear grabbed her cubs and disappeared in the opposite direction. Within seconds, the immediate area was clear of bears. But the helicopter couldn't land in the rough terrain, and the pilot's voice crackled over Captain Rodriguez's radio with urgent news. "Ground team approaching your position from the east. ETA 5 minutes. Storm is intensifying rapidly. We need to get everyone out now before conditions become impossible for ground or air rescue." Sarah looked to the east and saw lights moving through the trees. A full rescue team with all-terrain vehicles was making their way toward them, but they were still several minutes away. The helicopter continued to circle overhead, its searchlight sweeping the area to keep any remaining bears at a distance. 5 minutes, Captain Rodriguez said. "We just need to hold our position for 5 more minutes." But the storm had other plans. The wind suddenly increased to near hurricane strength, and the rain became a solid wall of water falling from the sky. Visibility dropped to almost zero, and the helicopter was forced to climb higher to avoid losing control. "We're losing visual," the pilot reported. "Wind shear is too dangerous at low altitude." "Ground team, can you see their position?" The response came from the approaching rescue team. "Negative. Visibility 0 in this sector. Need another flare for location reference." Sarah looked at the flare gun in her hands. Her one remaining shot. She could use it to guide the rescue team to their location, but then they would have no protection at all if the bears returned. "Do it," Captain Rodriguez said, reading her thoughts. "The helicopter scared off the bears and the ground team is almost here. We need that flare to get everyone home safely." Sarah took a deep breath and aimed the flare gun straight up into the stormy sky. This was it. Their last chance. She pulled the trigger. The bright red flare exploded overhead like a firework, cutting through the rain and darkness with brilliant light that could be seen for miles. For several seconds, the entire mountainside was illuminated in red light, showing their exact position to the rescue team. "Visual confirmed," came the voice of the ground team leader. "We have your location. Moving in now." Within minutes, the rescue team reached them with all-terrain vehicles and medical equipment. Frank, Jim, Marcus, Lisa, Tom, Betty, Jake, Kevin, Alex, and the 3 rescue workers were quickly loaded into the vehicles and driven to safety. As they drove away from the mountain through the storm, Sarah looked back at the wilderness they were leaving behind. The abandoned cabin was still burning in the distance, a small orange glow against the dark mountainside. Somewhere out there, the bears they had encountered were probably finding their own shelter, waiting for the storm to pass. "Good shooting," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, sitting beside her in the rescue vehicle. Sarah looked down at the empty flare gun in her hands. 6 shots had gotten them through the most dangerous night of their lives. But it was that final shot, fired not to scare away bears but to guide rescuers to their location, that had ultimately saved everyone. "Just doing my job," Sarah replied, though she knew this had been far beyond anything her job description had prepared her for. Hours later, safe and warm in the park's main lodge, Sarah found herself surrounded by the people she had helped save. Frank's leg was in a cast, but he would make a full recovery. Emma was healthy and energetic again, already asking her mother when they could go on another hiking adventure. Everyone was exhausted but grateful to be alive. The storm finally passed just before dawn, leaving the mountains clean and bright under the morning sun. Sarah stepped outside and took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air. She had been a park ranger for 8 years, but she had never truly understood the power and danger of the wilderness until that night. Her radio crackled with a message from park headquarters. "Sarah, we've got a group of day hikers requesting a guided tour this afternoon. Weather looks perfect. Are you available?" Sarah smiled and picked up the radio. "Copy that, headquarters. I'll be ready." She had learned something important during the long, dangerous night. Sometimes the most important shot you can take is not the one meant to hurt or scare, but the one meant to call for help and bring people together. Her lone shot had indeed shattered the storm's roar, not with violence but with hope.